Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. The national discussion over diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, has evolved rapidly over the last few years. From outrage and a push for change after the murder of George Floyd to the present day, with the Trump administration working to completely erase DEI efforts from the federal government, the shifts in the public and political mood have been dramatic. This morning, we want to bring in some familiar faces to discuss this issue. We've heard from them before, and it's great to have them back. Joanna Kelly, the Assistant Mayor of Portsmouth, and Ryan Terrell, former NHGOP Vice Chairman. Thank you both for joining us on Close Up.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you. So you're both coming at this from very different political and ideological perspectives, but I just want to start with your big picture thoughts. Madam Assistant Mayor, in 4 years, how do we get from let's change this to let's get away from this?
Yeah, I think that there, as I would believe with this administration, there's a fear factor of a nation of what are we, who are we, and what are we going to be. There's this notion that pie can't be split equally. And so I think that we forget that the basis of DEI and inclusionary hiring and practices really comes from the opposite of what we've had a lot, which is nepotism and people in powerful places hiring their friends, their family members, and especially when we talk about in the government, making sure that we can get the best people at the table. And so it's, again, I think it's a fear-based notion that we're not getting the best people at the table because of DEI.
Mr. Terrell, what do you think about the arc of this discussion? Why have we seen such a dramatic change just over 4 years?
Well, DEI has been practiced from almost since the early 90s, and it saw a peak when we left the George Floyd riots as kind of a rebuttal to some race relation conversations and conversations about equality. But I think the stark drop has been because over 4 years we've seen that it's negatively impacted multiple sectors that DEI has been in place. And Joanna brings up the quality of the candidate. What happened is it starts to degrade us from going to progress towards a merit-based system or a merit-based economy. Because by DEI, what you're doing is you're supplementing being qualified for a certain position with immutable characteristics like race or sex to bolster certain candidacies. And anytime you do that, regardless of the immutable characteristic, you're naturally going to decrease the quality of the candidate because certain standards make sure that high quality candidates are placed in the positions that they belong to be in. And so that's where DEI, I think, is starting to see a drastic decline, where we just haven't seen the return on investment in those programs or its base level purpose, which was to solve an equity gap or an equality gap.
And so you draw this back all the way to the 90s. Obviously there was some debate over policies, but people didn't seem to be terribly upset about it until the last 4 years. What do you think was the impetus in the short term, I guess?
I think the heavy hand of government got involved when you started to see mandatory and required programs at the federal level and then also pushed down to the private sector. You're looking at implicit bias trainings. You're looking at equity-based trainings that really started to lean towards a certain political leniency, often towards the left or center left. And that's just not appropriate when the heavy hand of government starts to dictate the type of quality candidates and the type of training materials that are necessary to get quality candidates. Now, if corporate firms choose to take that stance on their own, that's completely fine, but I think that the reason why you have such a pushback is because the heavy hand of government got involved and it kind of played its hand too much.
Assistant Mayor Kale, what do you think about this? In particular, this idea that, for this reckoning around race, there was, it was a request for accountability, or did things somehow go too far?
Well, I think that one of the key issues we have right now with DEI is that we are so focused on race within the DEI. I almost wish that if we looked back and we could change the way the acronym was, maybe EID, and we look at that. Diversity does not equate to race. And I think if we can take a step back and think about that, then we will understand that these are still merit-based jobs. They are still people who are openly qualified, but we are looking at trying to make sure that we open the door to a more diverse group of American citizens to get into a workplace, that we make sure that we are allowing people from different social economic groups, allowing people from different educational backgrounds who can be equally as qualified to get into the room, to have the interview, to get into the training, to show that they can do the role, to be able to put women on the front line of battle who know that they can handle the emotional and physical stress, to make sure that we are allowing candidates like Ryan and myself. Anyone could look and say to Ryan and myself that we are DEI elected officials, or that we are DEI representatives, taking away all of the merit and the hard work that we did to be into those positions. And so again, I think the fundamental issue we have right now as a nation is we are looking at, and this is from the top down, we are looking at at diversity, equity, inclusion as a race-based program, and it is not.
You know, Assistant Mayor Kelly, a lot of the discussion used to be around equality, equality under the law, and that merged a little bit into equity, which is a concept that it seemed ran into some rocky shores, I guess, over the last few years of debates. What do you think about that discussion between equality and equity?
Yeah. I can understand it. I use the analogy a lot of times when I'm talking to my friends about this, about like a football team, right? You don't want a football team of 100-star quarterbacks. You need different positions and different players. You also need to make sure that those players are equipped with things that allow them to do their role effectively. And so making sure that equality, that you're lining up to understand. And I think it's a little bit of an empathetic position sometimes to understand that not everyone has access to the same level of entry, education, or understanding from people. So I don't necessarily view them as fundamentally different. I view them as just, as Ryan and I have said, two sides of the same coin.
And Mr. Torello, what do you think about this? Obviously, equality, there's a concept a lot of people can get behind. Equity, some people start to see that as maybe redistributive. What are your thoughts?
In our country, we believe in equality of opportunity and not equality of outcome. And so anytime you start to adjust for equality of outcome, which I would argue equity-based programs started to lean into, that's when you start to have a disruption, and that's when people rightfully have kickback, because we bring up race. The reason why most folks frame DEI centrally to race is because that's the way that it was enforced throughout the federal and state level in most private firms, where now you were hyper looking at race, like you said, in response to the George Floyd riots, and essentially putting people into positions of power based on the racial context of the candidate. And similar to what Joanna brought up, two sides of the same coin, I don't necessarily agree with that, because every inequality is not injustice. And when you start to equate equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity, equality of outcome cannot be achieved all the time. And when you have quality people go into a school system or a workplace, the equality of outcome is not going to be guaranteed. And so for me, all types of merit-based systems that reward individual self-entrepreneurship or achievement or qualifications, we should be bolstering those types of programs, because the cream of the crop will rise regardless of how they look when you apply those systems.
Go ahead.
I just want to make it clear, when we talk about DEI, and the U.S. Department of Labor statistics show that European descent women, white American women, have been the #1 beneficial group. But right now we're seeing a target, especially on African Americans, in their merit base. When we look at it, they're not even in the top 5. You know, we have Asian Americans that are above African Americans in the benefits of DEI, indigenous peoples, the queer community, and like I just mentioned, white American women. So we cannot take away the fact that right now our government, led by this administration, is targeting DEI as a race-based issue. And it is not, because we know, again, based on the U.S. Department of Labor, that minorities have benefited the least from DEI programs. We're not even beginning to talk about the veterans' benefits of this. And as Ryan has mentioned, from the 90s, but really this goes back to 1944 with the Veterans Preference Act. And then we also have the disabled accommodations. And so again, we are narrowing ourselves in the conversation when we lead with race. We are not talking about the other groups in our society that benefit from DEI programs from a corporate level and from a government level.
Did you have something to say there?
Yeah, I just don't think, so those statistics I've also read, it's also just not appropriate for any group to benefit themselves from programs that put immutable characteristics over qualifications, regardless of what those group types are. And as I said before, the reason why most folks flock to race when they think about DEI is because that was the overall branding and message from large proponents of DEI throughout the past 4 years. But for me, my main interest is how DEI policies have potentially affected some of the most malleable minds in our country, and that's young people. I mean, throughout our country over the past 4 years, we've had lower quality standards for education based off racial demographic in certain areas. We're all but removing comprehensive testing for certain racial categories because of disparate impact under the guise of DEI. And so when you start to remove and lower standards, especially achievement standards for young people, and going all the way up to high skilled positions, regardless of the kind of proponents basic reason why they put in forward DEI. In reality, what happened is it hyper-focused on race, and it started to decrease standards among a bunch of different industries, and that's just not appropriate for any group of people that benefit those programs.
Last question to you, Assistant Mayor Kelly. What is the future going to look like for the young people who are coming up? They may have experienced a little bit of this, and now there's going to be this turn. What do you think is going to happen to the kids?
Well, I think that you have to look at this next generation that are coming up who are all about equality and all about inclusion and all about a diverse group of perspective. And what we're doing right now is telling them that they don't matter. And so I think what we're going to see in the next 10 years is this new generation coming up saying and fighting more for the rights that they have seen others have that are slowly being stripped away from them, and saying, like, no, I do matter and I want to be included and my diverse perspective is needed.
All right, Assistant Mayor of Portsmouth Joanna Kelly and former NHGV Vice Chairman Ryan Terrell, thank you so much for being here. Wish we could continue this for a long time, but all we got is about this 10 minutes. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, when we come back from one big issue to another, the upcoming vote at the State House on right-to-work legislation.